Yesterday, 6 Republican members of the House of Representatives stood in the well of the chamber and cast votes that publicly broke from the direct command of Donald Trump, a moment of visible defiance inside the party that has structural implications far beyond a single legislative resolution. He had a warning ready in under 5 minutes flat, not a whisper, but a statement that went straight to Truth Social, promising that those who break ranks will seriously suffer the consequences come election time. That includes primaries. This move was a sharp contrast to Speaker Mike Johnson's public attempt, made just moments before the votes were tallied, to frame the action as one the administration understands, an assessment Trump's own post. Labeling tariffs a generic privilege, not a tax, immediately contradicted. That sequence of events, from a public vote to a public rebuke within 5 minutes, exposed a significant, and perhaps growing, fissure on trade strategy within the party hierarchy. This specific, concrete defiance by 6 lawmakers matters because it wasn't a symbolic protest vote with 0 consequences attached. It was a move that directly addressed $21 billion in existing Canadian retaliatory tariffs hitting American exporters and a threatened second wave of $87 billion more, creating economic pressure that finally outweighed a perceived partisan mandate. The context for this fracture has been building, extending back to last October when 4 Senate Republicans, including Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul, joined Democrats on a similar but non-binding resolution also targeting Canadian tariffs. What yesterday's action does is translate that upper chamber dissent into direct legislative action, led by a group that includes high-profile figures like Thomas Massie and Don Bacon, the latter of whom is retiring, and therefore not vulnerable to Trump's specific primary threat. That detail tells you how the math of the political risk was calculated differently for these 6, some of whom feel the economic gravity of cross-border trade acutely. What that action does structurally is redirect the immediate focus toward exactly what protected these 6 members politically. Don Bacon and Dan Newhouse represent large slices of trade. Newhouse's Washington state, for instance, trades heavily in apples, wheat, and machinery across that Canadian border, and he posted that tariffs have harmed Washingtonians full stop. Bacon is retiring, so Trump's primary threat only bites if you are running. Massie has clashed for years on executive powers, and Trump already publicly backed a challenger months ago. So for him, this specific fight is a long-standing one. This calculus, pairing local economic pain against a standard party line, reveals that for a small but notable minority, math is finally outweighing political messaging. What this framework suggests is a template for other vulnerable Republicans to prioritize local economic data over national strategies, a pattern that markets and other foreign capitals will likely analyze closely as a measure of the limits of single-party cohesion. Now, the part that moves markets and household budgets isn't a theory. It is the $21 billion in Canadian retaliation that has already hit industries as diverse as steel, aluminum, and lumber. These aren't abstract trade statistics. They are invoices and rising costs that farmers, manufacturers, and small businesses in these districts have complained about repeatedly, according to Jeff Hurd of Colorado's 3rd District. Heavy on agriculture and steel, these economic costs were magnified by another detail. On February 20th of this year, the Supreme Court ruled Trump couldn't legally use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, for these blanket tariffs. The justification, based on declared fentanyl trafficking, which only account for a tiny fraction, 0.2%, of total fentanyl seizures at the Canadian border as of fiscal year 2024, was deemed unlawful. But the administration kept collecting the 35% tariff anyway, a contradiction that created a profound business uncertainty. Bacon and Hurd kept warning everyone about, showing that rule of law and stated national emergency are now in conflict, adding another dimension of legal risk to the existing economic cost. What that response by Trump's National Economic Council Director, Kevin Hassett, reveals is that the White House took this specific defeat with strategic seriousness, not as a fruitless exercise as Speaker Johnson called it. Hassett told reporters bluntly, "We're disappointed in what the people have done," phrasing an elected representative's floor vote as a public failure. 6 votes should not sting a coherent policy, especially one that Trump defends as having given us economic and national security, a mantra he repeated regardless of the specific trade relationship or target. That response signals that the administration knows the legal foundation is shaky and that retaliatory tariffs are already causing real American business math to fail. What this framework suggests is that the next round of votes Democrats are already signaling targeting Mexico tariffs or Global Liberation Day tariffs will follow a similar pattern, where the economic case is powerful and the legal one is questionable, pushing more Republicans to choose between Trump and their district. Let's go back to the dollar figures, because they tell the real story here. Trump has cited Dow Jones and S&P 500 highs as proof of tariff success. Yet Tax Foundation researchers calculated the real cost of these tariffs amounts to roughly $1,100 per American household annually by 2026. This generational shift in tax burden, the largest tax increase as a share of GDP since 1993, is exactly what Democrats have unlocked a procedural tool to highlight, piece by piece, vote by vote. What this details tells you is that a stock market high does not erase a family's weekly grocery bill, and the disconnect is exactly what Representative Gregory Meeks, the Democrat who introduced the resolution, hammered on when he asked Republicans, "Will you keep prices high out of loyalty to one person?" When the price data backs up that claim and invoices for real businesses in the districts of Massey, Bacon, Kiley, Hurd, Fitzpatrick, and Newhouse arrive, math eventually wins over political loyalty. The precedent has now been set for 10 Republicans across 2 chambers to defy Trump, translating a stated emergency into concrete, calculated economic choices. The immediate implication, the unresolved tension everyone watching is focused on right now, is where this goes next. The resolution has now passed the House, 219 in favor to 11 against, and moves on to the Senate where, despite similar fractures among some Senate Republicans in the past, it faces a predictable path towards Trump's predictable veto. The fundamental math remains. Neither chamber, as it stands, has the 2-3 majority needed to override that veto. Symbolically, this creates a paper trail and a pattern that markets have noticed, but practically, the specific 35% Canada tariff that courts called unlawful but still active is likely to survive the year intact, trapped between court rulings and a presidential signature. But the more consequential question, the one that every future tariff resolution will now be framed against, was still unanswered. The structural divide over trade policy has moved from a series of rhetorical skirmishes to a recorded clash on the House floor, exposing a basic tension between party unity and local economic survival. While the 35% tariff on Canadian imports remains active, despite a decisive Supreme Court ruling, the 6 dissenting Republicans have demonstrated that a $1,400 annual household cost increase creates a real domestic political liability. The strategic question now shifting the focus of international analysts is not whether these individual lawmakers will survive their respective primary challenges, but how this internal friction will reshape the broader American trade posture heading into a critical legislative window. The tactical maneuvering following that vote reveals that the White House is no longer managing a unified coalition, but a deeply fragmented front. This morning, internal Department of Commerce documentation revealed that the federal government has instructed customs officials to continue collecting the 35% duty on Canadian goods under the authority of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, despite a lower court order explicitly halting the practice. That sequence of events is not coincidental. It is a direct policy statement that the executive branch intends to maintain tariff revenue as diplomatic leverage regardless of traditional judicial constraints. For domestic businesses, this means that the legal gray zone described by lawmakers like Don Bacon is an intentional feature of the administration's negotiation stance rather than an administrative oversight. The strategic implication is that international supply chains must now budget for long-term legal volatility, effectively treating the courts as an ineffective check on trade executive actions. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney shifted the diplomatic baseline during an address in Ottawa by stating that Canada will not enter formal negotiations for a revised trade treaty until the United States provides a legally binding mechanism that prevents the unilateral imposition of emergency tariffs. What that response reveals is a deliberate choice not to close a door to future diplomacy, but to establish a rigid structural boundary that a standard executive order cannot easily bypass. By demanding formal treaty-level guarantees, the Canadian government is attempting to force the American executive to involve a divided Congress in any final resolution. This strategic posture effectively uses Canada's $21 billion in retaliatory tariffs as an economic shield to run down the clock while American domestic political pressure builds. The Tax Foundation's updated mid-year economic analysis indicates that the cumulative effect of the Canadian duties has already resulted in a 4.2% reduction in manufacturing output across the American Midwest, primarily due to spiked input costs for specialized steel and aluminum alloys. That detail tells you that the real-world economic drag is concentrated in the exact geographic regions that form the core of the ruling party's electoral coalition. The data undercuts the administration's public narrative that foreign exporters absorb the full cost of trade restrictions, providing raw numbers that dissenting lawmakers can use to justify future floor rebellions. Consequently, the economic reality on the ground is actively eroding the political viability of treating broad-based tariffs as a frictionless diplomatic tool. The House Ways and Means Committee quietly filed a procedural notice expanding the scope of upcoming trade reviews to include reciprocal tariff structures currently applied to the European Union and Mexico. This sequence is highly deliberate, indicating that opposition leadership has successfully mapped out a legislative path to force successive votes on every active emergency trade declaration over the next 90 days. Each scheduled vote will compel frontline representatives to publicly choose between national party loyalty and the immediate financial interests of their home districts, effectively replicating the precise friction seen in the Canada vote. Structurally, this transformation of trade policy into a recurring domestic referendum ensures that the administration's economic strategy will face continuous public friction. During a closed-door briefing with corporate stakeholders, National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett defended the continued use of emergency declarations by stating, "The President possesses the inherent constitutional authority to protect the nation's economic security, and legislative efforts to restrict that authority weaken the country's global bargaining position." What that statement reveals is a definitive legal philosophy that views congressional oversight as an impediment to executive efficiency rather than a constitutional requirement. By framing legislative dissent as a threat to national security, the administration is signaling that it will not compromise on its trade powers, even in the face of adverse Supreme Court rulings. The long-term implication is a structural standoff between two branches of government that will likely require a definitive secondary constitutional test. The latest export data from the Department of Agriculture shows a 14% month-over-month drop in transborder grain shipments, matching the exact timeline of Canada's implementation of its targeted agricultural counters. This concrete decline in trade volume directly explains why agricultural representatives like Jeff Hurd are encountering intense constituent pushback during local town halls. The numbers confirm that retaliatory measures are hitting highly liquid, politically sensitive sectors that cannot easily absorb prolonged market closures. What this dynamic guarantees is that the internal party rebellion will intensify as harvest seasons approach and storage costs accumulate for American producers. A secondary fissure has emerged within the financial sector itself, as recent Federal Reserve regional reports indicate that mid-sized domestic banks are tightening credit lines for industrial manufacturers heavily exposed to Canadian supply lines. That detail tells you that the financial markets are no longer treating these tariffs as short-term negotiation tactics, but as a structural reality that increases the default risk of American companies. The tightening of credit creates an immediate secondary wave of economic friction that operates independently of direct tax increases or retaliatory duties. The strategic result is a compounding of the domestic cost of the tariff policy, making the administration's victory lap data regarding stock market highs less persuasive to the businesses actually driving the industrial economy. The strategic focus now narrows away from the floor of the House of Representatives and toward a specific, impending event that will test whether this legislative rebellion can achieve actual structural permanence. The Senate Finance Committee has scheduled a formal hearing for next Tuesday to review the statutory definitions of national emergencies under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a session specifically designed to draft legislative text that would automatically terminate any tariff-based emergency order after 60 days without explicit congressional approval. Whether the committee can secure the single swing vote needed to advance that text to the full Senate floor will determine the structural limits of executive trade power for the remainder of this term. The procedural maneuvering in the House and the shifting lines of diplomatic resistance highlight a structural reality that cannot be managed by social media messaging alone. While the immediate focus remains fixed on party discipline and executive authority, the deeper disruption lies in the changing relationship between national political mandates and local industrial survival, the intersection of a legal gray zone where the administration continues collection despite adverse judicial rulings, and an escalating trans-border trade dispute has forced a recalculation of strategic risk inside the legislative branch. This structural shift moves the conversation away from temporary political loyalty and directly into the systemic mechanics of how North American supply chains operate under prolonged duress. For Canada, the outcome of this legislative friction reinforces a strategy of defensive endurance rather than immediate concession. By holding a firm line on the requirement for treaty-level guarantees and maintaining $21 billion in targeted counter-tariffs, Ottawa is effectively leaning into the domestic friction, playing out within the American agricultural and manufacturing sectors. The recent House vote provides the Canadian government with concrete evidence that its retaliatory strategy is generating the exact political leverage it intended, showing that prolonged economic pressure can fracture a single-party majority. Consequently, Canada's next logical move is to sustain its retaliatory posture through upcoming legislative sessions, betting that expanding localized economic damage will pull additional frontline American lawmakers into the dissenting column. For the United States, the strategic landscape is transitioning from unified executive execution to a state of continuous domestic pushback. The administration's choice to use emergency declarations under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act as a permanent framework for broad-based trade policy has inadvertently created a predictable vulnerability that opposition leaders can repeatedly exploit. By demonstrating that a handful of localized defections can collapse the party's legislative shield on trade, the House vote has effectively provided a template for challenging future executive actions. The White House must now budget significant political capital simply to maintain defensive lines around its existing tariff structures, a requirement that reduces its flexibility to launch secondary trade initiatives without facing immediate domestic challenges. Other major trading entities, specifically Mexico and the European Union, are analyzing this internal friction as a baseline measure of the durability of American trade policy. The revelation that the largest tax increase as a share of GDP since 1993 can trigger immediate legislative rebellion gives foreign capitals a distinct roadmap for handling future reciprocal tariff threats. Rather than rushing to offer broad concessions, these global actors are likely to deploy highly surgical retaliatory structures designed to target the precise congressional districts where representatives face the tightest electoral margins. This localized approach converts national trade friction into immediate domestic political liability, shifting the global calculus from one of compliance to one of managed domestic pressure. The overarching pattern revealed by this sequence of events is that broad-based economic restrictions eventually generate structural limits that executive mandate cannot easily suppress. When a specific policy pushes household costs toward a projected $1,400 pived increase annually and disrupts critical industrial credit lines, the localized economic reality inevitably collides with national partisan discipline. The strategic defiance of 10 lawmakers across both chambers is not an isolated incident of legislative friction, but a reflection of a deeper systemic rebalancing where mathematical necessity begins to dictate political survival. As international retaliatory pressures accumulate alongside tightening corporate lines of credit, the administration's ability to project unified control over trade strategy will face increasing internal constraints. The single most important takeaway from this structural clash is that national trade policy can no longer be executed in isolation from the direct financial realities of the domestic industrial base. When the legal foundation of a major economic policy is explicitly rejected by the judiciary, yet maintained by the executive, the resulting market volatility transforms local commercial invoices into immediate legislative leverage. This dynamic proves that the absolute central repository of trade power in the American system remains anchored to the economic consent of the districts that drive the industrial economy, an